why the CIA director made a mysterious trip to Moscow. John Ratcliffe meeting with Russian officials early this morning. Trump downplayed the significance of the visit. Here he is.
He's there on, very sort of semi-routine. I hate to disappoint people. We would like to see the war with Ukraine end.
No, definitely not routine. That's why it's startling that it happened. So America gives an explanation. Russia has already denied it. I have my own secret explanation. That'll be fun for everyone. But first of all, you got to find out the whole story, isn't it? So that's why we go to Ann.
Yes. Oh, I'm so curious what your theory is. I do not know exactly why our CIA director visited Moscow, but I will tell you what both sides are saying about this meeting, beginning with the Wall Street Journal's so-called exclusive on this reporting and the whole event. Now, remember, this is, I think, a peak example, perfect example of how the media, especially legacy media, works. Someone within our government or a group of people within our government anonymously leak something to the reporters, and then they just regurgitate it in their reporting, and that's what happened here. So it's titled, CIA Chief Surprise Moscow Trip Was to Warn Russia Not to Attack NATO, even though NATO member countries have been talking about attacking Russia incessantly, and I'll get to that in just a minute. But nonetheless, the argument is that our CIA director, John Ratcliffe, visits Moscow specifically to warn Russia in person against striking NATO. So you would be under the impression that Russia is making some moves, right? There is some indication that Russia poses an imminent threat to our NATO allies. They're thinking about striking soon. But get a load of this, okay? Bear with me as I go through the reporting here. So, citing anonymous sources who were briefed on the visit, they claimed that Ratcliffe was there to deliver a warning to Russia not to attack NATO countries. Again, that sounds like it must have been an imminent threat to NATO countries. But the same piece, the exact same piece, notes this. New US intelligence assessments reported earlier by the Wall Street Journal that Russian President Vladimir Putin could try to test the resolve of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization with a limited assault on an allied country in the next few years. What? I don't believe for a second that John Ratcliffe went there to warn against attacking our NATO allies. US officials are concerned that Putin could launch an assault ranging from a cyber attack to a small scale land incursion, likely on a Baltic nation. So you're telling me that there is allegedly intelligence indicating that Russia might do like a small scale operation or strike against a ally of ours a few years from now. And that's why our CIA director needed to travel to Moscow to meet with officials there. He didn't meet with Putin, according to the reporting. Putin was briefed on the meeting afterward. But Cenk, I'm dying to know what your theory on this is. What is this about?
Okay, so what it's not about is normal Russia, Ukraine, or Russia, NATO, because they've been in this war the whole time. Trump's been president for nearly 2 years now, so there's no need to send a secret plane with our CIA chief to Russia to talk about that. And even if they're planning to attack Estonia, we've been talking about that now for about a decade, maybe more, since Russia attacked Georgia. So it's not like it's impossible, but it's also not normal. I mean, not abnormal, right? So, and there's no reason why we couldn't say that publicly or that we couldn't use regular channels. So he went there to deliver a message in person about something super important. There's no question about that. Not something that is, as Trump said, semi-routine. This is not a semi-routine process at all. In fact, it's extraordinarily unusual. So my guess as to what it could be that important is, now some things are gonna happen next. The most important thing is that Russia not join a war against us, because then the world blows up. So do not join a war against us. So, well, what could be a war against us? Because we're not joining the Ukraine-Russia war. We're financing Ukraine, but we're not physically in it. That makes a huge difference because we're both nuclear-armed countries, and we don't want to face off against Russia. That risks the entire planet, right? There was one thing that happened recently that would actually put us in a war together. Ukraine hit an Iranian ship. And if the war broadened and Ukraine is fighting against Iran, and then drags Russia into fighting with Iran, well, we're fighting against Iran, then all of a sudden the battle would be joined and Russia would be against the United States. And that is super duper dangerous. There's a second thing that was announced just recently, which is if anyone is working with Iran, we're going to do sanctions on them. And the sanctions are not normal sanctions. We're gonna take you off the dollar. Now, if we take you off the dollar, that's a thermonuclear economic threat and puts us into a conflict of sorts with folks. Now, that doesn't necessarily lead to a war, but if we're gonna do that, certainly Russia will view that as a very hostile act. So I could understand why a president would send someone to talk to the Russians now. Like, look, guys, we're gonna do these things that might bring us into conflict. Let's avoid that conflict. So let us do whatever we're going to do against Iran, et cetera. And whatever happens with Ukraine is maybe your business, right? But let's not, by the way, if they're doing that to make sure that we avoid a conflict with Russia, that's not a bad thing. That's a good precaution. So in a sense, I'm giving them the benefit of the doubt that it's a trip that's meant to avoid something bigger and worse for America. And Anna, we also know that our foreign policy is, well, I think it's 100% controlled by Israel. So if that's the case, they're not going to talk about something that isn't related to Israel. And Israel's the one that's basically trying to get the whole world into some massive worldwide conflict, talking about attacking Turkey. Could that have ramifications for Russia, who's right next door? So something to tell the Russians, when we do X, do not counter it and do not join the war. Noble Mobile is one of our top sponsors. We love those guys. They save you a ton of money. So they've got a new proposal for you guys. It's gonna save you even more. So you can't pay more than $50 ever. You get money back for if you don't use your data. So it's already an incredible deal. TYT.com/switch. Now they're saying your first month is going to be only $10. So that's depending on how much data you use, savings of $20 to $40, right? You could download the app to track your brain rot index. That's how much you can save each month using your phone less and spending more time doing things that actually make you happy. So just a ton of wins in here, and the cell phone service for me has been perfect. I didn't have to change my phone or anything else on the phone. So please don't waste money. So if you're paying over $50, definitely. I think if you're paying over $30, switch now and you get the first month for $10. So TYT.com/switch, TYT.com/switch. By the way, now this is getting further out there, and I hope to God this isn't anywhere near what was discussed. But a couple of times now, the Israelis and Israeli supporters in American media have started to talk about nukes. So if anyone uses a nuke, then the Russians would certainly, be on a red alert. And by the way, if you were to nuke Iran or Turkey, they're both right next to Russia, and the radiation could go over to Russia, and they are allies with Iran. So if you were worried about Russia retaliating on the most important issue of nuclear, you would do something extraordinary like send your CIA chief on a secret mission to say, let's not nuke each other. So those are your options. What is not an option is, it's a regular routine checkup with the Russians about a thing that we've already been talking about for a decade.
Right, and obviously we're just speculating here because we don't have much to go off of, and I certainly don't trust either government to tell us the truth about what the discussions were really about. For instance, Dmitry Peskov, the spokesman for the Kremlin, said a lot of this kind of scare story material, the claim that Russia is making preparations to potentially strike a NATO ally of ours a few years from now, is being published right now. Of course, it has nothing to do with reality and nothing to do with the intentions of the Russian Federation. But although he provided very little clarity on what they did discuss, the head of Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service said that he held a working level meeting with Ratcliffe to discuss unspecified and sensitive matters falling within the remit of their respective intelligence services. So I like your theory a lot, Cenk. And I think I would put more weight behind it if I was more optimistic as you, but I'm not as optimistic as you. What you just detailed in your theory is something that would require a government that actually is a little more forward thinking, that's making preparations to kind of minimize the type of devastating destruction and damage that would be done to our country or the world through the types of military action that you were describing. I just don't see this administration as the type of administration that prepares for anything, really. They seem to shoot from the hip. So the idea that Ratcliffe traveled to Moscow specifically to warn against doing certain things in retaliation or in response to our actions in the Middle East, I just find it hard to believe. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm being too pessimistic.
And so, Anna, two things about that. Number one, if you're gonna send your CIA chief to have this kind of extraordinary conversation, that's why I mentioned what I mentioned at the end. The thing that's most likely to have that spark that conversation is the potential for nukes. That's the number one reason why you would want to have a super secret meeting between the intelligence agencies. Now, let's hope that I'm wrong, and obviously that's speculation. I have no idea what they discussed internally. I wasn't in the room, and neither was anybody else. But that leads to my second point, which is, here's what the intelligence of the Russians and the Americans are not going to do. Tell the press what they actually talked about. So whatever reason they gave publicly is definitely not the correct one. Otherwise, they wouldn't have had a super secret meeting in person between the two heads of their intelligence groups. They're not going to tell you what they actually met about. There's a 0% chance of that.
The other thing I want to just note, on the topic of Russia potentially attacking a NATO ally of ours, I would just ask kindly, nicely. I know people are going to be up in arms about this, but I would just say that NATO allies need to stop provoking Russia. And I genuinely do mean that. What do I mean by that? Okay, stop talking about balkanizing Russia. Stop talking about weakening Russia and breaking it up into 5 parts. Please stop doing that. That is not making the situation better for you. I get that you guys hate Russia. You can hate Russia all you want, that's fine. But when you are having conferences and you're making public statements about balkanizing Russia, what do you think Russia is gonna do in response to that? They're gonna see that as a security threat, and they're gonna carry out the types of actions that they've carried out against Ukraine. And I would like to prevent that from happening. So maybe ease up on the overextending Russia talk, because I don't think it's helpful if you're actually trying to, create an environment of world peace.
Yeah, and so look, guys, it doesn't mean you're soft on Russia. It doesn't mean you want them to invade countries or that you're going to prevent them from invading countries. But you don't need to provoke a war for no reason, right? So we want to try to make sure we don't get into any further conflict with Russia. And so the better way to do that is to not antagonize them. If I thought that it reeked of weakness, I would say so, and I've said so in the past. No, at this point, we've done a lot of war. Nobody thinks we're weak or unwilling to get into stupid wars for almost no reason and to stay in them for decades on end. Believe me, that's unfortunately our reputation. So we don't have to protect that reputation. Everybody knows, right? Look, I want to go to graphic 10 here because I want to give you guys a sense of another thing that triggered for me why this might have something to do with something that isn't just Russia and Ukraine. Zelensky put out a statement saying, "I received warm congratulations to the people of Ukraine from Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel. Our countries share deep bonds between our people, between our people in the first place, but also in the economy, culture, and other areas. It is therefore good to hear of Israel's desire to strengthen these existing ties. We count on working fruitfully together to bring about more security." And Netanyahu wrote him a letter, and that's what he's responding to. It was very warm. Netanyahu doesn't write a letter to the president of Ukraine for no reason. He does it because it involves some sort of strategy related to Israel where they're going to create more war. And by the way, that's not in dispute because Ukraine did bomb an Iranian ship out of nowhere to try to merge the two wars, which would again be basically a world war. And if I thought there was going to be a world war, I'd send my CIA chief to talk to the head of intelligence for Russia as well.
I just think that everything that's transpiring right now, the way things are developing for the West in particular, is so short-sighted, so dumb, especially when you consider where the United States is at right now when it comes to its Patriot missile interceptors. We have depleted them, yet we're still engaging in provocative acts, we along with our allies, that would indicate that we're putting ourselves at risk. If we don't have enough missile interceptors to carry out a war against Iran, what makes anyone think that we would have the missile interceptors necessary to provide protection to Ukraine, provide protection for ourselves here in the United States, considering the fact that we're making enemies left and right on the international stage through our support for genocide and the barbarism that Israel carries out in the Middle East? Like, what are we doing?
Yeah.
I don't understand what the end game is here. Like, what is the goal? What are we trying to do? Are we trying to get ourselves killed? Are we trying to get the civilians living in these allied NATO countries killed? Why? What's up with all the provocative actions? Why is Ukraine getting involved in our war against Iran? It's just so utterly stupid. And rather than maybe taking a beat, taking a look at the situation we're in right now and figuring out how to, I don't know, unravel, like get out of this, we're doing the opposite. It's insane. It's totally insane.
Yeah, the only scenario that I can think of that's extreme enough to warrant this kind of trip is and you're making a good point about our interceptor missiles. Since we're running so low on them, it's possible that we just can't defend Europe conventionally in the way that we used to be able to. So that might mean that we went over to deliver a threat, like, because the Russians know we're running out of interceptor missiles. And well, now everybody knows because it's all over the press. But that might embolden them, and maybe you go there to deliver a threat. You better not go into Europe. If you go into Europe, we're gonna do something worse than interceptor missiles. But whatever that conversation was, it was super important about really dangerous things.
Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, you're not winning friends, you're not making allies by putting out love letters to a guy who's wanted. He's a fugitive of the ICC, okay? Benjamin Netanyahu is a war criminal who is wanted by the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity. And here you have Volodymyr Zelensky putting out a love letter to him on social media. Like, what are you doing? And by the way, you want the territory of Ukraine to be respected. What about the territories that belong to the Palestinian people in Gaza and the West Bank? That doesn't matter to you, right? You're willing to make an alliance with a literal war criminal who has carried out genocide in Gaza and is aiding and abetting the slaughter and displacement of Palestinians in the West Bank.
And by the way,
it doesn't make any sense.
Let's think that through for a second. So on one thing is, I'll agree with Anna, like if you want our money so that you could do an alliance with a maniacal genocidal government, no, thank you. No, that's like to us saying like, oh, in the middle of the the Bosnian genocide, oh, I'd like to make an alliance with the Serbs who are slaughtering people as we speak. Well, that makes me not want to do an alliance with you, right? That's weird. Second of all, why are you reaching out to a government that is so deeply unpopular in America? 2/3 of Americans now disapprove of Israel, borderline hate them, and you think it's a good political idea to get Israel on your side so that America will help you more. Oh, right, you would only do that if you know what we're saying on this show, including in this segment, which is that it doesn't matter how much Americans don't like Israel or don't approve of Israel, our government works for Israel. So that's why he's going to basically our dad and going, hey, tell your son America or tell your servant America to do X, Y, or Z. That is and by the way, it's not just about America. The rest of the world now hates Israel. They have almost no allies other than the puppet dictators in the Middle East that report to them. Outside of that, the whole world is turned on them. So how could it possibly help Ukraine unless you knew for a fact that Israel controls American foreign policy? So that's why you had to make an alliance with Israel so that America will stay in the war longer for you.
Right, and there are all sorts of foreign policy analysts who believe that Ukraine intentionally struck that Iranian vessel in the Caspian Sea in order to inject itself in the war so they can get their hands on weaponry they need and interceptors. The problem is, and I don't know why world leaders are having a hard time understanding this. I'm not an expert, but I understand it because I listen to the experts. You don't just snap your fingers and boom, missile interceptors appear. It takes years to build them. Okay, so Zelensky says he needs 300. We don't have 300 to give him, not even close. And it's gonna take years to build them. So intensifying war, injecting yourself into another war because you think it's gonna work out well for the Ukrainian people is just so unhinged and so stupid, but here we are.
But Anna, to be fair to Zelensky, if he thinks the same thing we think, it's not necessarily stupid. He's going to what he perceives to be the most powerful force on earth. That if you want America to do something, you ask Israel to do it. And then you do them a favor. That's why he taxed the Iranian ship to do Israel a favor so that he could beseech Israel to get them to order us to help Ukraine. That's kind of logical because they are our boss and Zelensky sees the same thing we see.
It would be logical under normal circumstances, but we are not experiencing normal circumstances. We have depleted our interceptors and we are running out of missiles. It's stupid. The whole thing is stupid. You have to factor everything in. And I don't think he is. That's the point I'm trying to make.
Yeah, well, anyway. The thing we 100% agree on is wrap up the war. That's the smartest way to go. Stop getting everyone killed and get to a peace deal already. Every time you ring the bell below, an angel gets his wings. Totally not true, but it does keep you updated on our live shows.